Now this is a simple list here. In this red zone, you've got things that you definitely want to avoid. So we've got the top of the list, this is grains. And so classically, there's this acronym that's sometimes used, BROW, if you will. That's barley, rye, oats, and wheat. So it's an easy way to remember, if you're new to the gluten-free diet, an easy way to remember the classic grains that contain gluten that are definitely taboo if you're trying to follow a gluten-free diet. So, but we're gonna go a little deeper even than that, because there are other grains, for example, corn, rice, sorghum, millet. These grains all contain forms of gluten, although classically considered to be safe. In my clinical experience, people going gluten-free, trying to eat these types of grains instead as substitutes, tend to do very, very poorly. I mean, they don't recover their gastrointestinal inflammation. They don't fully recover from gluten-induced damage. So I would caution you not just on the brow grains, but I would also caution you on corn, rice, sorghum, millet, and teff, and some of the others as well. We'll put a list up for you. Now, in addition, there are pseudo grains. And pseudo grains, classically, you have amaranth, you have quinoa, and you have buckwheat. Now, there's a problem with these pseudo grains, and again, these are commonly used as substitutes in the gluten-free world for baking and for cereal-based products. There were some research studies done on quinoa, this was a number of years ago, that found that quinoa proteins actually mimic and create, mimic classic gluten like the gluten found in wheat, but also create inflammation. So they cause that inflammation within the GI tract. A lot of people, in my experience, again, do very, very poorly if they're trying to use quinoa as a substitute. And then we have amaranth and buckwheat. Now, the problem with amaranth and buckwheat is that these two grains, pseudo-grain cereals, are actually very frequently cross-contaminated, meaning that they will be problematic because they have contamination from other grains like barley, rye, oats, or wheat. So that cross-contamination, I think the last study I read on this showed that cross-contamination was present in up to 40% of products that you could buy in the grocery store, and those products were labeled gluten-free. So I want you to be very, very careful around any of these pseudo cereals or pseudo grains as well. So not just grains, but also pseudo grains. Now we also have highly processed foods. Now for several reasons. One of the reasons why is highly processed foods oftentimes have filler ingredients that are grain-based, right? Like wheat, for example, is a common filler in a number of highly processed foods. You get a lot of corn as a filler. You get a lot of rice as filler in these types of products. So I'd caution you to be very, very careful. But even beyond the fillers that can contain grain, there's some researchers now that are looking at food additives and other chemicals that are found in food. And a lot of your processed foods contain glyphosate. We know that one of the accelerators to gluten sensitivity, one of the things that ramps up or makes it worse, is the pesticide glyphosate, which is commonly found in ultra-processed foods. We also know that a lot of the additives, for example, MSG, is a very, very common food additive, generally contains gluten in it, and you have to be careful for that because that's not super obvious. Now I'm gonna load up some information here for you to check out. So if you look at this diagram here, again, extreme caution in these different terms. You'll see a lot of these different terms, artificial colors, flavors, and I'll put a link to this. I'll give you this list. So if you're interested and you're really wanting to do the deep dive, just look in the comment section below or in the description of the video below, and I'll make sure that you have access to this list. But these are all different ways that we can find hidden gluten in processed foods. So MSG being an example, but there are a number of other examples as well. Natural flavors, natural colors, non-dairy creamers, pre-gelatinized starch, smoke flavor, textured vegetable proteins, vegetable gum, or just, again, this is a list of examples of foods that don't come right out and say gluten, but these terms can mean hidden gluten, and you want to be cautious if you are buying those processed foods and eating them and trying to make them a staple food in your diet. Okay, and then we have beer, malted beverages, and other grain-based spirits. So again, beer, very obvious. Most beers are derived from some type of grain like wheat. Malted beverages, for those of you who aren't aware, malt is another one of those tricks. We actually see this with chocolate too. But malt is derived from barley. And so you want to be aware of that. It's a sweetener, it's a sugar derived from the grain barley. And so you'll sometimes see malted beverages. A typical malted beverage would be like wine coolers, or even some of these newer drinks that are coming out now that like ciders. Some of them have malt as a sweetener in them, so you have to watch out for those if you're talking about alcoholic beverages. And then malts, on the same note, malt is very commonly found as well in chocolate, so you've got to be real careful when you're looking at chocolate, because, you know, think about it, chocolate technically is gluten-free, but it's what they put in it that isn't the cocoa bean that can get you into trouble. So again, going back to here, anytime you're buying a processed food, it's very critical to read the label, look at the food ingredient list, and compare it. Again, I put the link down below this video. Compare it to the terms on that list. And generally speaking, if you don't see those terms, you know you're going to be safe in avoiding that. Now, there's also grain-based spirits. So, you know, again, examples here would be things like whiskey, vodka. Now, I've got an entire gluten-free alcohol guide for those of you who really want to do a deeper dive on this topic. We'll go ahead and put that link below as well, so you can do a deeper dive on gluten-free alcohol if you need to. But a lot of belief around spirits is that because they're distilled, they actually won't have any of the gluten protein left in them, albeit that is a true statement. I have seen people with gluten sensitivity reacting to grain-based spirits quite aggressively, so I would just caution against them. Now, whiskey generally is derived from wheat. You got things like bourbon generally derived from corn. Vodka can come from wheat, it can come from corn, it can come from potato, it can come from grapes as well. Now, grapes being grain-free would be okay. So again, it boils back down to what is the spirit being produced from, and do they add any of those flavoring agents, because a lot of the distilled spirits now are different flavors. They'll make them in vanilla flavor, peach flavor, and a lot of these flavors can be derivative of grain, meaning they produce those flavoring agents from different grains. So you've got to watch out and be careful there. And then last on the list of obvious things with gluten in the red zone are baked goods. Baked goods being things like, you know, cakes, pies, cookies, donuts. You know, if you make it with flour, generally speaking, it's classically a baked good. Pretty obvious to avoid those types of things, but you have to watch out for a lot of the baked goods that are being sold in the store, and they're being labeled as gluten-free because many of them, again, they'll have the big two that are used in a lot of these substitute products are corn and rice. And again, corn has a gluten called zein, rice has a gluten in it called orzonin, and those two there are research studies that show that many people with gluten issues continue to react when they're consuming corn and rice. So you've got to be real careful there. And if you're following no grain, no pain, you know, my advice is to keep the rice and the corn out.